My name is Robert Calloway, and I want to tell you about the quietest kind of love there is, the kind that never announces itself, never asks to be seen, and spends a whole lifetime making sure someone else's world stays warm while its own grows cold. I want to tell you about my father, but first, I want you to get comfortable. Pull the blanket a little higher. Let your shoulders drop. Whatever the day gave you, the weight of it, the noise of it, you can set it down right here, right now. You don't need it anymore tonight. I'll carry the story. You just breathe. His name was Harold Calloway, but everyone in Millfield, Ohio called him Hal. He was not a large man, 5'9" on a good day, thin through the shoulders, with hands that seemed too big for the rest of him, rough and wide and permanently stained along the knuckles from 31 years of the Harmon stamping plant on Route 40. He had brown eyes that went quiet when he was thinking, a habit of rubbing the back of his neck when he was worried, and a laugh that started slow, like an engine turning over in January, before it finally caught and filled whatever room he was in. He was not the kind of father who said, "I love you," easily. That wasn't his generation, wasn't his upbringing, wasn't the particular emotional vocabulary of the Calloway men, who came from a long line of people who showed what they felt by doing, by fixing, by staying. My grandfather had been the same way. His father before him. Love in our family was a verb before it was ever a word, and my father was its quietest, most devoted practitioner. I didn't understand that when I was young. I spent most of my childhood wishing he'd just say it. Just once. Plainly, the way fathers on television said it, kneeling down, looking their sons in the eye. I spent a good portion of my teenage years resenting the silence he offered in place of it. It took me until I was 34 years old and standing in a hospital corridor in January, snow coming down outside a window I couldn't open, to finally understand what he had been saying to me my whole life. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning. I grew up on Sycamore Lane, in a 2-story house with green shutters and a front porch that tilted slightly toward the yard, as though the house itself was leaning in to hear the neighborhood's business. My mother, Ruth, kept the garden. My father kept everything else. He was always fixing something. The gutters, the storm door, the basement sump pump, the squeaky third step on the staircase that he renailed every spring and that somehow managed to squeak again by October. The house was old and always had more needs than we had money to answer them, but my father treated it with the kind of patient, steady attention that I have since come to associate only with love. He worked the day shift at the stamping plant, which meant he was up at 5:15, out the door by 5:40, and home by 4 in the afternoon with grease under his fingernails and a quietness on him that took about an hour to lift. My mother would have dinner on the stove. I would be at the kitchen table doing homework, or, more honestly, pretending to do homework while actually reading a paperback novel hidden inside my math textbook. My father would come in, hang his jacket on the hook by the door, wash his hands at the kitchen sink for exactly as long as it took the water to run clear, and then sit down at the table across from me, with a cup of coffee my mother had already poured. He never asked me what I was doing. He just sat there, and the kitchen filled up with the sound of the evening, the stove, my mother moving around, the muffled television from the living room, and gradually, slowly, the day would release its grip on him. His shoulders would come down, the line between his brows would ease. He would pick up the newspaper and read it without saying anything, and I would go back to my fake homework, and that was, I realize now, one of the most peaceful rooms I have ever been in. I didn't know it then. I thought it was boring. I thought most things about my father were boring when I was 12. The thing I remember most clearly about my childhood, the detail that returns to me again and again when I think about who my father was, is this. Every year, on the first day of school, without fail, without ever being asked, my father would be waiting at the bus stop when I came home. Not every day, just that first one. I don't know exactly when that tradition started, or how it ended, only that for years it was simply there, reliable as weather. He would be standing by the big oak tree at the corner of Sycamore and 4th Street, still in his work clothes, his hair uncombed from the day. He never made a big deal of it. He didn't say, "I came to see how your first day went," or "I wanted to be here." He was just there. And when the bus pulled away and I walked toward him with my backpack and whatever was already tangled in my stomach from the day, the new teacher, the new locker, the complicated social arithmetic of another school year, he would simply fall into step beside me, and we would walk home together without saying much. And somehow that was enough. Somehow that was everything. I asked him about it once, when I was maybe 15, old enough to notice the pattern, but still young enough to be embarrassed by my own noticing. "How come you always come to the bus stop on the first day?" I asked, trying to sound casual, like I was just making conversation. He rubbed the back of his neck. He looked down at his boots. "Figured you might want company," he said finally. That was all. I nodded. He nodded. We went inside. And I spent the next 20 years thinking that was an insufficient answer, before I understood it was actually the whole truth. I was not an easy teenager. I want to be fair to my father here, because the story I'm telling you is his story, and he deserves the full picture. I was restless in the way that certain kinds of quiet places produce. Restlessness. Not because Millfield was bad, but because it was small. And I was 17, and the world beyond it seemed enormous and urgent, and full of things I couldn't name but already desperately wanted. I had my mother's imagination and my father's stubbornness, which is a combination that made me, in those years, occasionally impossible. I fought with him about college. He wanted me to stay close, Ohio State or maybe Kent State, somewhere within driving distance. I had applied, without telling either of my parents, to a school in Boston. Not because Boston was particularly meaningful to me, but because it was far, and far was what I wanted most. When the acceptance letter came in March of my senior year, I sat on it for 2 weeks before showing it to my mother. And I showed it to her first because I knew she would absorb the initial shock so that, when my father found out, there would already be a path worn through the idea. I don't remember the exact conversation when I told him. I remember pieces of it. The kitchen again, evening, my mother standing near, the stove doing something with her hands to keep herself occupied. I remember my father's face going through a series of expressions, too quick and controlled to fully read. I remember him asking how much it cost, and me telling him, and the silence that followed being the loudest silence I had ever heard in that house. He didn't yell. He didn't forbid it. He sat with it for a long moment, rubbing the back of his neck, and then he said, "We'll figure it out." I didn't ask what that meant. I didn't ask what it would cost him, what adjustments would have to be made, what the difference was between what my partial scholarship covered and what the real number was, and who was going to carry that difference on his back for 4 years, on a stamping plant salary. I just said okay, and went upstairs. And I am not proud of that. College was everything I had wanted it to be, which meant it was overwhelming and exhilarating and largely consisted of me discovering how much I didn't know. I called home on Sundays. My mother and I talked for 45 minutes about everything. Her garden, her book club, the neighbors, my classes, my friends, the city, the food. My father would get on the phone at the end, and we would talk for about 4 minutes, and the conversations were always the same. He'd ask if I was eating. I'd say yes. He'd ask if my car was running okay. I'd say I didn't have a car. He'd say he knew that, and then he'd say, "Good, good," a few times, and hand the phone back to my mother. I thought then that he had nothing to say to me. I think now that he had everything to say, and no language for it, and those 4 minutes were the fullest 4 minutes of his week. I came home for Thanksgiving that first year and found the house exactly the same, and my father, somehow smaller, not physically, but quieter, folded a little further into himself. My mother told me later, privately, that he'd picked up a second job in September. Weekend shifts at a hardware store in Derby, 40 minutes away. He hadn't mentioned it to me because he didn't want me to feel guilty. He hadn't mentioned it to me because he didn't want me to feel guilty, she said, in a tone that suggested she was telling me precisely so that I would. I confronted him about it that weekend. Not confronted. That's the wrong word. I brought it up, sitting at the kitchen table, the old familiar quiet of the house around us. Mum told me about the hardware store, I said. He shrugged. Extra hours. Dad, you're working 7 days a week. Keeps me out of trouble. He picked up his newspaper. I sat there for a moment and then I said, you didn't have to do that for me. He looked up from the paper. His brown eyes went through that quick, complicated thing they did. He said, I know I didn't have to, and went back to reading. I have thought about those 5 words for 30 years. I know I didn't have to. It is the most precise definition of sacrifice I have ever heard. I graduated in 4 years, moved to Columbus for work, and spent my 20s building a life at the pace that your 20s allow. Slowly, expensively, with a lot of wrong turns that eventually became the right path. I got a job at an engineering firm. I met a woman named Patricia at a work conference in Cleveland. I married her on a Saturday in October, in a small ceremony at a vineyard, outside of Columbus. And my father stood in the second row in a suit that still fit him from my parents' 25th anniversary dinner, and he cried. I had never seen him cry before. He stood in the second row of chairs on that October afternoon, and he cried without making any sound, just his face working quietly against itself. And when I walked over to him after the ceremony, he shook my hand and pulled me into a hug that lasted longer than any hug we'd had since I was small. And he said into my shoulder, "Good man. You turned out good." That was the most he had ever said to me about who I was. I held it like something precious the whole rest of the day. Patricia and I had a daughter, Nora, born 3 years into our marriage, a small, fierce person who came into the world with opinions already formed and a volume that suggested she had a great deal to say. I watched myself become a father and found it the strangest mirror. I could see, suddenly from the inside, what the view from my father's side of our relationship must have looked like. The sleeplessness, the particular love that is not sweet but urgent, not calm but ferocious. This animal need to stand between your child and everything that might hurt them. The terror of it, the extraordinary privilege of it. I called my father more after Nora was born. Our phone calls got longer. They were still not emotional in any conventional sense. We still talked about practical things, the car, the house, the weather, but they were longer. And there was something in the silences between topics that had changed texture. Something warmer, something more honest. He retired from the stamping plant when I was 31. 31 years he had given that building, that line, those machines, and he walked out on a Friday afternoon with a card signed by his co-workers and a gift card to a steakhouse and a pension that was less than it should have been, and more than a lot of people got. My mother called me to tell me about the retirement party, her voice bright with something that might have been relief. "He seems lighter," she said. "He seems like he can breathe." I drove up that weekend. He was in the backyard when I arrived, just standing in the garden my mother kept, looking at the tomato plants, his hands in his pockets. The October light was long and gold across the yard. He looked thinner than I remembered. He had aged in the specific way that hard-working men age, not gradually but in chapters, as though the body waits until it has a moment to rest before updating its accounts. "Hey, Dad." He turned around. He smiled. That slow-start engine smile. "Hey, Bobby." He hadn't called me Bobby since I was 10. I didn't say anything about it. I just walked over and stood next to him in the garden, and we looked at my mother's tomatoes together, and I thought, this is what I want. Whatever this is, This particular quality of afternoon. This particular man standing next to me. I want it to last. It didn't last. Nothing does. But what ended it? And how it ended? And what he did in the ending? That's the part I need to tell you. He was diagnosed in November, 2 years after his retirement. Pancreatic cancer already at stage 3, which is the kind of diagnosis that arrives not as a door closing, but as the sudden understanding that the door has been closed for a while and you simply hadn't noticed. The oncologist explained the options. My father listened with the same expression he'd had when I told him about the Boston school processing, controlled, not letting the inside show on the outside. My mother called me that evening. She was trying to be steady and not quite managing it, her voice thin at the edges. I drove to Millfield the next morning. I found my father at the kitchen table, always the kitchen table, with a cup of coffee and the newspaper. Same as always, same as 30 years of mornings. He looked up when I came in. He looked at my face. "Don't," he said. "Dad, I mean it, Bobby. Don't do that." I sat down across from him. I put my hands on the table. I said, "What do you need?" He looked at me for a moment. Then he nodded, like I had given the right answer. "Help your mother figure out the insurance stuff. She doesn't do paperwork well. Okay, and don't rearrange your whole life. You've got Nora. You've got Patricia. You keep that going. Okay, I mean it about that second one. I know you do." He picked up his coffee. He looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, at my mother's garden, dormant for winter. He said, very quietly, as though he was saying it mostly to himself, "I had a good run." I had to look away from him for a moment. We spent the morning doing exactly what he'd asked, going through the insurance documents, the medical files, making lists of calls to make and things to organize. My father was methodical and focused, the same way he approached every problem, practically, patiently, without drama. He took notes in his cramped left-handed handwriting. He asked clear questions. By noon, there was a folder on the table, with all the relevant information, organized and labeled, and he seemed satisfied with that, the way he'd always seemed satisfied with a fixed drain or a repainted porch, as though the act of putting things in order was itself a kind of comfort. Over lunch, while my mother was in the other room, he said to me, "I want you to know something." I waited. "The money for your college, the extra. I never thought of that as a sacrifice." He said the words slightly carefully, like he'd been turning it over. "I thought of it as an investment. And it paid out." He looked at me. "You understand what I'm saying?" "Yeah," I said. My throat felt tight. "I understand." "Good." He picked up his sandwich. "That's the only time I'm going to say it." "Okay, Dad. Don't make a face." "I'm not making a face. You're making a face." I laughed. He laughed. That slow-turning engine, catching, filling the room. My mother appeared in the doorway to see what was funny, and he waved her off, still smiling. And that was one of the last times I heard him laugh like that, full and unguarded, before the treatment started, and the days began to narrow. He fought it the way he'd done everything else in his life. Quietly, without complaint, with a focus that looked almost like stubbornness, but was actually something older, and more essential than that. He went to his treatments on Tuesdays. He came home and slept. He was up by dinner. He still read the paper. He still sat at the kitchen table. He never once, in 8 months of treatment, said that it wasn't fair, or that he was scared, or that he resented any of it. What he said, when he said anything, were the specific and practical things. What he was hungry for, what he needed fixed, what he wanted to do that weekend if he felt up to it. I drove up every other weekend. Sometimes more. Nora came with me often, and he was different with her than he had ever been with me at her age. Warmer, more openly delighted, as though grandfatherhood had finally given him permission to show what he'd always felt. He would sit with her on the porch for hours, the two of them looking at whatever she'd brought to show him. A drawing, a rock she found, a book about horses, and he would ask questions and really listen to the answers, and she would talk with the fearless fluency of a 7-year-old who has never once considered the possibility that she is not worth listening to. I watched him watch her, one afternoon in May, the light coming gold through the sycamore trees, and I thought, he is doing it again. He is doing the thing he's always done. He is standing between someone he loves and whatever is difficult, and making sure that what she sees and feels and carries from this is only the warmth. That was what he'd done for me my whole life. Made sure that what I saw and felt and carried was only the warmth. The costs. The 7-day work weeks. The folded down dreams. The quiet years. Those he kept on his side of the ledger. Invisible. Intentional. A whole private economy of love that I had spent most of my life not reading correctly. He died on a Sunday morning in August, in the bedroom of the house on Sycamore Lane, with my mother holding one hand and me holding the other, and the window open to let in the early morning air, which smelled like her garden, and like summer and like every August morning that house had ever held. He went the way he'd lived, without a lot of noise. His breathing changed, and then it slowed, and then it stopped, and the room was very still, and outside a bird was singing somewhere in the yard with complete indifference to the fact that the world had just become different. I sat with him for a long time after. My mother went to make phone calls. I just sat. The morning light moved across the floor in the way that morning light does, and I held his hand, which was still warm, still rough across the knuckles, still large in the way his hands had always seemed large. I thought about the bus stop at the corner of Sycamore and 4th Street. I thought about a phone call that lasted 4 minutes on a Sunday. I thought about a folder of insurance documents organized on a kitchen table. I thought about I know I didn't have to. I thought about an investment that paid out. I thought about a suit from a 25th anniversary dinner, and a hug that lasted longer than usual, and you turned out good. I thought about all the years I had misread him, the years I had translated his silence as distance, his practicality as coldness, his steadiness as limitation, and how wrong I had been, and how he had never once pushed back against my misreading, just kept doing what he did. Kept showing what he felt through the only language he had, patient and faithful and completely without resentment. I thought about how much room I had taken up in his life, and how he had never once made me feel the weight of it. How he had made me feel, instead, like my presence in his life was a privilege he'd been given rather than a responsibility he'd accepted. The difference between those two things, between burden and gift, is a father who knows how to love, even when he doesn't know how to say it. That was 11 years ago. Nora is 18 now, taller than me, fierce and thoughtful and wonderfully herself. My mother still tends her garden on Sycamore Lane. The front porch still tilts toward the yard. I drive up a few times a year and sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and sometimes, in the particular quiet of that room in the evening, I can almost feel him there. His newspaper, his work-rough hands, his eyes going quiet when he was thinking about something. I've been a father for 15 years now, and I understand him better every year. Not because I've gotten wiser, exactly, but because I've learned the texture of the love he carried, the way it asks nothing in return, the way it doesn't need to be named to be real, the way the whole secret of it is that it never stops. You don't do it for the recognition. You don't do it because it's easy. You do it because somewhere along the way, this person became the whole point, and everything else, the cost, the labor, the years, the quiet, becomes simply the shape of how you show them. I still go to the bus stop. Not a literal bus stop, obviously Nora is grown. But I know what my father understood, that on the days that are hard and new and uncertain, sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone you love is just be there, when they come around the corner. Not with answers, not with speeches. Just there. Just, I figured you might want company. That's it. That's the whole instruction manual for this particular kind of love. My father gave me that. And 1,000 other things he never put words to. And I have spent most of my adult life slowly understanding what I was given. I think I'll spend the rest of it trying to pass it on. So if you're listening to this tonight, if you've pulled your blanket up and the day is finally behind you, maybe take a moment before you drift off. Think of whoever gave you that quiet kind of love. The person who showed up without saying they were going to show up. The one who worked a second job and didn't mention it. The one who held your hand and watched you leave and wished you well, when what they wanted was for you to stay. Thank them, if you can still reach them. Understand them, if you couldn't before. And if they're already gone, if what you have now is only memory, then know this: the love they gave you didn't go anywhere. It's in the room with you right now. It's in the way you know how to be steady when things get hard. It's in the way you show up for the people you love. It's in everything they built in you without ever pointing to what they were building. That love is still working. It will always be still working. Let it hold you tonight. Let yourself rest in it. You're safe. You're warm. You're here because someone once thought you were worth every quiet sacrifice they never mentioned. Sleep now. Sleep well.